A woman's hand was inside his chest, not pressed against it, inside it, fingers spread around something warm and slowing. Qin stood in a field of rubble that had been a city, smoke still curling from craters that hadn't finished cooling, and he could not lift his arms. The woman in front of him had silver hair threaded through with black, and her eyes held the flat patience of something that had never learned to hurry. She was pulling the energy from him the way you drain water through a crack, slow, thorough, certain. Behind him, his allies lay somewhere in the ash. He didn't know which ones were still breathing. 90,000 people had already fed her ritual before this moment. He was supposed to be the last. His left arm burned, the arm where the system lived, and the sensation was almost like a question. A faint pulse from something that had carried him across worlds and through wars and was not finished yet. He had walked a long road to end up here. It had all started much smaller than this. A bag of chips, a girl he loved, and a father who looked at him like arithmetic that didn't add up. Qin Shuang was 20 years old and owned nothing worth mentioning. His apartment was small enough that both walls were reachable without fully stretching his arms, and the convenience store job he kept smelled permanently of fried oil and cleaning solution. He carried his poverty carefully, the way people carry chronic pain, without advertising it, so it didn't flare up in front of others. The thing he refused to be sensible about was Zhang Laku. Her father owned 3 hospitals and a genetics company, and he wore the wealth with the ease of a man who'd long ago forgotten what it cost. Laku wore none of it. She called Qin first, saved him the window seat, and loved him in the steady, unspectacular way that some people love. The kind that doesn't ask to be noticed, just stays. Her father had arranged a single meeting with Qin in a lobby that cost more to furnish than Qin made in a year, and he'd laid it out without raising his voice. Laku was free to spend time as she liked, but the word worthy had sat in the air afterward, weighted and very specific. He wasn't talking about character. Qin bowed, said nothing, and rode the bus home. He sat with his hands in his lap and watched the stops go by until his came. He fell asleep that night with a half-finished bag of chips on the pillow beside him, an old habit from years of eating alone in bed, to make it feel less like a meal and more like company, and woke up somewhere else entirely. The building was not his building. The city was not his city. 12 stories up, the wind carried something with no name, part rot, part electrical charge, like a storm passing over a landfill. Below, in the street, shapes moved. He made the mistake of leaning over the edge to look. They were human-shaped and not human at all. Skin gray-green and slack. Movement wrong in the way a clock runs wrong when something inside has stripped. Dozens of them, and more around the corner. The bag of chips was still in his hand. He looked at it. He looked at the things in the street. The sky above was the color of old bruises. Purple-gray, sunless, thick. His left arm pulsed. When he pushed back his sleeve, text floated up from the skin, clean and readable, like something printed on air. System initialized. Dimensional transfer complete. Host, Qin Shuang. He read it 3 times. His heart was going fast, but his hands had gone oddly still. The stillness of shock, before the body remembers to shake. Down in the street, one of the gray shapes tilted its head upward. The sound came first, a single crack, sharp and clean, from the building across the alley. The shape below dropped in 2 pieces, severed from shoulder to hip along a line so precise it barely looked like violence until the pieces separated. A woman landed on his rooftop, 3 seconds later. She was already cleaning the blade. She looked at him the way you look at luggage left behind on public transport, with mild puzzlement, nothing hostile, and asked without preamble whether he was an evolutionist. He said he didn't know what that meant. Her name was Xiao Yanlin. She had been surviving in this place for 2 years, long enough that she'd stopped keeping the number somewhere she had to look at it regularly. She explained the world in short, efficient sentences, the way someone briefs a latecomer who needs to catch up quickly so they don't slow everyone down. 200 years ago in this timeline, she said, this timeline, the way a mechanic says, the other engine, a meteor had seeded a virus into the air that spread faster than organized society could respond. The dead rose, the living died strange. The survivors who discovered that zombie cores, compressed black crystals inside each creature's skull, could trigger human evolution, had built a rough, violent civilization on that single fact. Evolutionists ranked from level 1 at the bottom to something approaching level 12 at the theoretical ceiling, each tier representing a real, physical transformation. A level 10 being could level a building bare-handed. What a level 12 could do was largely unconfirmed, because the people who'd found out hadn't reported back. Xiao was level 3. She said it without pride or apology. Qin looked at the street below, which was now significantly tidier than it had been, and decided not to mention the text still glowing on his arm. The system spent the next several hours teaching him what it was, mostly by waiting for him to figure it out. The dimensional jump was its center, the ability to step back to his own world and return, limited by a counter that refilled when he absorbed zombie cores. Around it, a skill tree offered abilities still locked: speed, a combat method the interface called Doom Bullet, perception upgrades, something labeled Rapid Recharge, and at some distant node, an ability called Abyssal Physique that he couldn't read the full description of yet. Points to buy them came from cores. Cores came from dead zombies. The math was simple. What the math didn't make immediately obvious, but what became clear within hours, was the trading gap between worlds. Medicine was nearly extinct in the apocalypse. 2 centuries of supply chain collapse had reduced pharmacy access to folk remedies and whatever desperate chemists had managed to synthesize from local materials. Packaged food was a fading memory. Gold, which no longer had functioning markets in this world, sat in abandoned bank vaults in quiet, unguarded rooms with no one left who knew what to do with it. And in his world, medicine was cheap, food was cheap, and gold was very much worth money. He had a system nobody knew existed. He had access to 2 economies that had never heard of each other. He kept his sleeve down and said nothing, even as Xiao watched him with the patient attention of someone conducting a slow assessment that she hadn't announced. 3 days in, a zombie caught Xiao across the forearm in a corridor fight they'd gotten pushed into by a collapsing section of building. The wound wasn't deep. It went septic within 6 hours anyway. The air here carried things his immune system had no vocabulary for, and presumably hers did, but only up to a point. She cleaned and wrapped it herself without comment, and by evening her temperature was high enough that she'd gone quiet. That was how she showed pain, he'd already learned. She just became still, and said nothing about the fever climbing behind her eyes. His decision took less time than he would have expected. He told her he'd be back. She looked at him strangely, as if he'd said something that didn't scan. 40 minutes later he was in his bathroom with the light on, searching the medicine cabinet with the focused calm of someone who has made up his mind and is just executing. He found the half-finished penicillin prescription he'd never completed, added the ibuprofen, grabbed what bandaging he had, and jumped back. The apartment smell followed him briefly, that particular combination of his life, ramen, and old laundry, and the quiet dust of a room with one resident. And then it was gone. Xiao's fever broke before morning. She held the blister packaging for a long time, turning it in her hands, reading what text she could parse. She asked how he'd gotten it. He said he had contacts in the real world with medical supplies. She studied his face, then the packaging, then him again, and said that if that was true, he was more useful than he looked. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was close to one. Ruyu arrived 4 days after that. Xiao's younger sister, smaller framed and darker eyed, carrying an ability the system would have labeled super information processing, the capacity to absorb, store, and cross-reference data at a speed that was quietly unsettling to observe in practice. She looked at Qin for a long moment when Xiao introduced them and said, precisely, that she hoped he understood the difference between gratitude and trust, because she had seen people mistake the first for the second often enough to know how it ended. He said he understood. She watched him anyway, not hostilely, just thoroughly, the way someone works through fine print. The first zombie Qin killed entirely on his own was a level 1 stray. He used a length of rebar he'd been carrying since day 2, and it took 4 strikes, 3 more than he'd planned, and all 3 extra ones were ungainly. The core was walnut-sized and warm when he pried it free. His system absorbed it with a faint flicker across the interface, and what he felt wasn't power. It was the shape of where power would eventually be. A door into a room not yet furnished. Over the next 2 weeks, things started arriving. Speed was the first change, not the dramatic blur of action stories, just the small functional gap between his body's intention and its response growing shorter, until he moved a beat faster than he expected to. He returned to the modern world twice during that stretch. The first time he brought coffee, ground, sealed in a tin. Xiao received it with an expression she immediately tried to suppress, and the expression was joy, clean and brief, and gone before she could decide whether to be embarrassed by it. The second time he brought more antibiotics, bought with money he'd converted from the first gold he'd exchanged. He deposited the remainder in careful increments, small enough to be invisible, steady enough to build. By the end of the first month, he was level 2. By the standards of this world, level 2 was the point where you graduated from helpless to functional. Xiao had years of level 3 skill on him and could still clear a cluster before he'd located the stragglers, but she had stopped monitoring him for signs of incompetence. The way she watched him had changed into something else, though she hadn't said what. And Ruyu had started memorizing his supply lists without being asked, which was her version of deciding she'd stay. The first time Qin walked into a real estate office and was not looked past, he noticed the difference without making much of it. He bought a mid-range apartment with converted gold, cash transaction. The agent shook his hand twice and used his name both times. He sent Laku a message that evening, the first contact since her father's intervention. She replied in under 10 seconds, which told him everything about how long she'd been waiting for it. She asked where he'd been. He said working. She sent back a single word, good. And that word did something to his chest that had nothing to do with the system. Her father received news of the purchase within a week. He arranged a meeting, which Qin attended because he needed the man to understand the direction of travel. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. Her father laid out his position. One property wasn't a foundation. This kind of wealth wasn't what established families respected, and he'd appreciate knowing the source of funds. Asked as politely as a suspicious man can phrase that. Qin said it was import arbitrage, rare materials, documented. Her father looked at him with the same arithmetic he'd always been running, the number in his head that Qin had always fallen below, and said he appreciated the initiative and hoped to see further progress in the future. Qin nodded and left. He was already 3 steps ahead, but there was no reason to say so yet. Lu Junhao had been pursuing Laku for 3 years and had developed a genuine cold dislike of Qin, not because of anything Qin had done, but because of what Qin not stepping aside represented. Men like Lu Junhao experienced the world as a place that generally sorted itself out in their favor. Qin's continued presence in Laku's life was an anomaly that offended him at a level below reason. At a gathering Laku had added his name to, Lu Junhao looked across the room and said, just loud enough, that he admired how some men dressed above their station. Designed to land as an observation rather than an insult, the kind that stings precisely because it can't be openly contested. Qin smiled and moved away. He kept a quiet list of things he wasn't ready to handle yet. Lu Junhao was on it. In the apocalypse, a name had begun appearing in faction reports, spoken in the careful, neutral tone people use for things they aren't certain are stable enough to say directly. The Witch Queen. No confirmed sighting anyone who'd seen her had reported back from. No face attached to the title. What was attached was an operation. Methodical, patient, built on the forced mutation of living people into weapons. The factions that knew of her called her organization the Despicable Society, which was accurate rather than creative. This was not theatrical villainy. It was industrial. Xiao mentioned it the way you mention a distant weather system. Present, confirmed, not yet overhead. Qin filed the information. He had more immediate priorities. The system's skill tree had been flagging something for weeks. A combat upgrade that required a level 5 zombie core, a tier he hadn't reached. He brought it up to Xiao as a theoretical, what would it take to find one? She was quiet for a moment. A level 5, she said, could kill 30 armed evolutionists who came in unprepared. She asked why he was asking. He said he wanted to understand his ceiling. She studied him the way she sometimes did, not with suspicion, but with the thoroughness of someone reading something important before committing to a direction. Then she said she knew where one was. She'd been avoiding the location for a year, because going alone was a problem she hadn't solved. Her eyes moved to his sleeve, the one he always kept down, and she said nothing about what she was thinking. He pushed the sleeve up. The interface appeared. Floating text, the skill tree, the dimensional jump counter, the core log. She read it. Ruyu crossed the room without being asked and read it beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched longer than felt comfortable. Ruyu said, very quietly, that this explained several things she'd noticed but hadn't mentioned. Xiao said they would leave at first light. Somewhere far across the dead city, in a direction none of them were looking yet, something was building an army from human suffering, one careful experiment at a time. They left before the city's darkness had fully separated from morning. Xiao moved ahead, silent on the broken road, her sword across her back. Ruyu walked between them with her eyes moving constantly, cataloging, cross-referencing, building maps inside her head she'd never need to write down. Qin kept pace and said nothing. The system on his arm was warm in the cold air, the way a phone gets warm when it's working hard in the background. The building they were looking for had been a municipal water plant. 6 floors, the bottom 2 submerged in the slow leak of a main that had burst sometime in the first decade after the collapse. Xiao had found the level 5 3 months ago, while clearing a path to a supply cache. She'd looked at it through a broken window, assessed the distance, assessed herself, and walked away. That was the kind of decision that kept people alive in this world, knowing what you couldn't survive yet and filing it for later. Later had arrived with company. The thing met them on the 4th floor. It was taller than it should have been. The evolutionary pressure that pushed zombies upward in rank tended to push them outward physically too, the body restructuring itself around the virus's logic of optimal predation. This one had fists roughly the size of a human head and moved with the horrible economy of something that had no instinct left except forward. It cleared 12 meters in under 2 seconds. Xiao hit it 4 times before it adjusted to her pattern, then went lateral, drawing it sideways so Qin could come from the right side. He hit it with everything the system had given him and slowed it down. Not stopped, slowed. His arms sang with the impact in a way that told him he'd found the limit of his current level. The creature turned to him, and for a moment the floor was very small. Ruyu's voice came from the doorway behind them. She said the pillar to the left had stress fractures. She'd counted 17 on the way up, and at the right angle, applied force would bring the upper section down onto the target without touching the load-bearing ones. She gave him the angle. She gave it in 3 words. He moved. Xiao covered his approach, taking 2 hits that she absorbed and redirected. The kind of technique you earn by being struck several hundred times in practice until the lesson stops hurting to learn. Qin hit the pillar at the angle Ruyu specified. The upper section came down across the creature's back with a sound like a building clearing its throat. It wasn't dead, but it was pinned, and the core was exposed at the base of the skull. He extracted it while it was still moving. The system absorbed it in a single pulse that moved up his arm into his shoulder and spread. Warmth. The real kind. The kind a body generates when it's rebuilding something. And for several minutes he sat on the wet floor with his back against the intact wall, while the interface ran through an update he could feel rather than read. Level 4. He sat and breathed. Outside the broken window, the dead city lay in every direction without end. Xiao crouched beside him after a while and said, in her direct, information-only way, that she'd never seen someone level up that fast. He said the system helped. She said most things that helped also had costs, and that she was asking not to pry, but because in this world, unknowns got people killed. He said he was still figuring out what the costs were. She nodded. That was an honest answer. She could work with honest. Over the following weeks, the shape of their arrangement became clear without anyone having to define it. Xiao led the hunts. She knew the terrain, the patrol patterns of factions that didn't need to know they existed, and which buildings held supplies worth the entry risk. Ruyu handled information. She absorbed everything she encountered and built a living index of it, and when Qin needed to know something about this world, she was faster and more complete than any source he'd found. He handled supply, real-world runs, and the growing problem of funding. Because funding was, rapidly, no longer a problem. He'd located a second vault. The apocalypse world had no shortage of former banks, sealed rooms full of metal and paper, in a civilization that no longer needed either. The gold went back home in manageable quantities, converted through 3 exchange points he'd identified for their low scrutiny and geographically staggered enough that no pattern emerged. The money accumulated. He had a property manager handle the apartment. He opened a second account, then a third. The chips he brought back for Xiao became a standing joke that wasn't quite a joke. She'd started leaving a specific spot in her kit open, and he noticed, and neither of them mentioned it. Ruyu asked once, very seriously, whether the production facility for a particular brand of seasoned crackers had survived in the original timeline. He said he didn't know, She said she'd accept that as an unsatisfying but probably honest answer. Just as Chief Kitchi ran a faction territory 3 sectors north of the water plant and had made his name by being the sort of man who used whatever authority he had to grow it. He taxed passing groups, controlled the local cache of evolution cores, and had developed a specific contempt for what he called drifters, people without faction affiliation who moved through the city instead of committing to one controlled zone. The contempt was practical. Independent evolutionists were leverage he couldn't apply. He found Kin when Kin was moving through his sector alone, returning from a core hunt. He had 8 people behind him, all of them level 2 or higher. He informed Kin that the route required a toll, not aggressively, the way people state things they're certain about. Kin said he didn't carry anything worth taxing. Kitchi looked at him the way he looked at most problems, as though the solution was simply superior application of force. He told 2 of his people to conduct a check. They found nothing. Kin had converted everything before crossing, but Kitchi had already decided this interaction had a specific ending, and the absence of valuables wasn't going to change it. He said the toll could be paid in service. There were always lower-level sectors that needed clearing, and drifters made good expendable labor. The system had been suggesting the evolution potion option for 3 days. Kin had a vial, one of 4 he'd managed to obtain through a real-world medical contact, synthesized from the genetic research files Xiao had helped him locate. The conversion rate for humans was somewhere between 10 and 35%. Below that threshold, the transformation wasn't survival. He'd been waiting for a moment with better odds. He looked at Kitchi, then at the 8 people behind him, then at the ground for a moment that probably looked like hesitation. He drank the potion. Kitchi started to say something and didn't finish it. What happened in the next 4 seconds was the system doing something it had never done before. Not an upgrade, not an absorption, but a reorganization. The interface flooded with text Kin couldn't read fast enough. Integration threshold met. Abyssal physique activating. Variant detected. Golden class anomaly. His entire body went white hot, the way metal goes when it crosses from red to white. And then it stopped, and he was standing exactly where he'd been. Except the ground felt different under his feet. Closer, more detailed. He could feel the precise angle of it. Kitchi raised his hand. The 2 nearest evolutionists moved on a signal. Kin hit Kitchi once, with a calibrated fraction of what the new physique offered, and Kitchi went back into his own people hard enough to rearrange the group. He wasn't dead. He was very done with the conversation. The 8 stood around the space where their authority had been. Kin picked up the core Kitchi had been carrying, the level 5 reserve he used to maintain local dominance, and absorbed it while they watched. The interface updated. Level 5. The golden abyssal physique pushed the absorption rate past anything the standard calculation would predict. He said they could report that a drifter had passed through, or not report it at all. Either was fine. He left north and didn't look back. By the time he reached Xiao's building, he was level 6, and 2 of the locked skill nodes had opened on their own. Xiao heard the full account and was quiet for longer than usual. Then she said she needed to think about what level 6 meant for their operational range. Ruyu was already building a new map of adjacent territories based on what the golden abyssal physique implied about his development rate. She said, without looking up, that her estimate of his maximum potential had required significant upward revision and she'd feel better with more data before committing to a number. He said that sounded like a compliment. She said it was data management, and she'd appreciate it if he didn't romanticize the distinction. Back home, the money had crossed a threshold that changed the texture of interactions. Laku's father had sources, the kind of people you pay to know things so you don't have to ask directly, and somewhere in the information flow, Kin's name had surfaced attached to a number that didn't match the arithmetic he'd been running. The man called a meeting. He chose a restaurant this time rather than a lobby, which Kin noted as the first meaningful shift. The restaurant was still expensive, but it had chairs on both sides of the table. Her father asked about the import business with the same polite suspicion as before. Kin showed him one document, a legitimate transaction record, one of many, in figures large enough to be interesting without being incomprehensible. Her father looked at it for a while. Then he asked whether Kin had considered property investment as a consolidation strategy, as though they were now 2 men comparing approaches. Kin said he'd considered it. He asked how Laku was. Her father said she was well. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man beginning to re-examine a position he'd been certain about. Qin said that was good to hear, and thanked him for the meal. Lu Junhao made his move 12 days later. He hired it out, which was the choice of someone who believed the problem was manageable from a distance. 2 men, a car, a route Qin used regularly. The intention was probably intimidation, the kind that ends in a hospital rather than a morgue. Damage that sends a message without producing paperwork. They waited for him outside the exchange office on a Tuesday evening, when the light had gone flat and the street was quiet. He saw them from the end of the block. The stillness of people trying to look like they aren't waiting is a particular, readable kind of stillness. He stopped, assessed, and walked toward them anyway. The first one moved fast. The second one had a weapon drawn. Qin caught the first strike, redirected the second man's arm by its wrist, gently, by the standards of what his body could now do, and stood in the space between them while they recalibrated. He said he knew who'd sent them. He said he had no interest in them specifically. He said they should go home. He said it without heat, the way you tell people something that's going to be true whether or not they believe it yet. They went. He tracked the commission back to Lu Junhao through 3 layers. Ruyu's information processing, it turned out, worked just as well applied to real-world networks when he gave her the raw data to run through. The trail was clear enough. He added Lu Junhao to his list, moved from not yet ready to pending. The name Base J04 came to him from Lu Chang, the Earth Alliance coordinator who'd made first contact the month prior. A steady-voiced man who distributed information the way careful people distribute anything scarce, with precision and no waste. Lu Chang had been mapping Qin's capabilities across several interactions, and his conclusions had apparently cleared some internal threshold, because he brought J04 up directly. It was a defended sector 2 days movement east. Captain Lai had held it for 4 years, built it from a processing point into something close to a functional community. Medical bay, food rotation, a ranked security force. He was a pragmatist who'd made hard choices in sequence and managed to keep most of his people alive, which in this world was a real achievement. The problem was what he was keeping from them. Hojimi had been in the sector for 8 months. His official function was research advisor. His actual function, which Lu Chang had assembled from procurement records, personnel disappearances, and 2 survivor accounts, was the development of artificial zombie kings through forced human augmentation. Genetic experimentation, targeted virus delivery, coercion structured as volunteering. The process failed more often than it succeeded, and failure in this context was not recoverable. Qin listened to all of it without interrupting. He asked one question at the end, whether Captain Lai knew. Lu Chang said the honest answer was probably yes, and that Li's calculus was likely that the base's survival as a whole outweighed the cost being paid by the people in Hojumi's facility. The calculus of a man who'd been surviving long enough to stop noticing what it required. Qin said he'd move on J04. Lu Chang said that the Earth Alliance would consider that significant progress. He said he wasn't doing it for the Alliance. He didn't say more. Xiao spent 2 days scouting J04's perimeter while Qin ran a supply run, his longest yet, a layered trip through 3 stops in his own world, timed against the system's jump counter with the focus of someone managing fuel on a long drive. He brought medicine in volume, antibiotics, antivirals, sealed surgical kits. Enough to matter if things inside J04 were as bad as Lu Chang's sources suggested. Ruyu cross-referenced everything the 2 accounts had described about Hojumi's operation and produced a facility map of the internal structure that was 2/3 conjecture, but labeled clearly which parts were inference and which were confirmed. He read it 3 times. He appreciated that she labeled the uncertainty. It was the kind of rigor that kept plans from dying on their first contact with reality. The night before they left for J04, Xiao sharpened her blade at the table while he went over the approach sequence one more time. The scrape of the whetstone was the only sound. At some point she said, without stopping, that if something went wrong inside she needed to know his dimensional jump counter. He told her the number. She nodded, filed it, and went back to the edge work. He understood the question underneath the question. If this went badly, could he get them out? The honest answer was probably. He didn't say that. He said they'd be fine. She didn't call him on the optimism, which meant she'd already accounted for the margin and decided the plan was still workable. Outside, the dead city stretched east in every direction, patient and massive, holding all its secrets in the dark. Base J04 occupied what had been a freight processing center. 3 large buildings arranged around a central yard, the original signage still readable if you knew what the old world's logistics companies looked like. Captain Lai had reinforced the outer walls with salvaged vehicle chassis welded flat, and there were lights running on a generator system someone capable had designed. From the outside, it looked like something almost civilized, the kind of place you'd want to reach if you were alone in the dark. The maintenance corridor Xiao had identified ran under the eastern wall through what had been a drainage system. She'd measured the passage on her scouting run by lying flat and timing herself. It was tight, she said. Fine for her. She looked at Qin's shoulders and said he should breathe out when the channel narrowed near the midpoint. He breathed out. They made it through. The inside of J04 had the particular texture of a place that runs on managed fear. People moved between buildings with their eyes down. Not defeated exactly, but calibrated. The way people move when they've learned not to draw attention to themselves by displaying anything that might attract attention. A community that had survived by deciding what it was willing to not look at. Xiao moved through it the way she moved everywhere, with the even pace of someone who belongs, which was the only pace that didn't pull eyes. Qin followed a step behind. Ruyu had stayed at their position outside to watch the eastern exit and relay information through the hand signal system she and Xiao had developed over 2 years of working together in places where sound carried badly. The restricted building was the northernmost. Newer reinforcement on the doors. 2 guards who stood with the particular alertness of people who've been told what they're protecting matters. Not the casual alertness of perimeter guards. The specific attention of people who know the inside. They watched from a second-floor window across the yard for 40 minutes. Guard rotation, supply delivery timing, the moment between one watch and the next when coverage thinned to 1. Xiao counted it out on her fingers while she watched, saying nothing. When she held up 2 fingers and tilted her head, he knew she meant, there. The guard at the secondary entrance wasn't expecting anyone from inside the yard. He was watching outward, which was where the threat model said threats came from. Qin moved in the gap between one breath and the next and put him down quietly. Not dead, just removed from the problem for the relevant window. The door opened from inside on a latch that Xiao dealt with in 4 seconds with a tool she produced from her kit without searching for it. The smell hit them before anything else did. Hojumi was not what the word researcher suggested. He was a small man, compact and precise in his movements the way surgical instruments are precise, designed around a single function. He had a quality of total absorption in whatever was directly in front of him that made the things not directly in front of him effectively invisible to his attention. He stood at a bench along the far wall when they entered the room and did not look up, because he was in the middle of something, and in the middle of something was where his entire existence resided. The room held 6 containment units. 4 were occupied. The people inside them were alive, in the technical sense, breathing, eyes open in 2 of the 4 cases, but they had been altered in ways that read, even to someone with no medical background, as entirely wrong. The evolutionary process these people had been put through was not the clean, voluntary kind that happened with zombie cores. It was something that had been forced through at speed, through a delivery mechanism Qin didn't recognize, and the bodies had responded to the forcing with the desperation of systems trying to accommodate something they weren't built for. Xiao's hand on his arm was a signal, not comfort. She tilted her head toward the door they'd come through. She'd read the room faster than he had and arrived at the exit calculation before him. He understood. The 4 in the containment units couldn't be moved. Entering further meant engaging Hojumi directly, and Hojumi would have a call mechanism, and the guards outside would. Hojumi looked up from his bench. He processed the presence of 2 uninvited people in his facility, with a speed that suggested this wasn't the first time someone had breached the perimeter. He pressed something on the bench surface without any visible urgency, the way you complete a task before addressing an interruption, and said to the room that he hoped they hadn't touched the door controls on the way in, because the containment units ran on a circuit tied to the external lock, and any interference would accelerate the delivery sequence in all 4 units. He said it calmly. He said it the way you explain a rule of physics, not as a threat but as information about how the world worked. Qin stopped moving. Hojumi said they could leave the way they came. He said he would consider the intrusion a miscommunication. He said this with the flat affect of someone to whom other people's choices were primarily interesting as variables. Xiao's grip on Qin's arm was tight. He didn't move. He also didn't leave. He asked Hojumi what the delivery sequence would do to the 4 people in the units. Hojumi said the outcome was statistically variable, but that forced mutation at this stage of the process typically produced a zombie-class hybrid. He said typically, with the mild interest of a man who found the variability professionally engaging. Qin looked at the 4 units for a moment. He looked at Hojumi. He said he wanted the unlock sequence. Hojumi said that wasn't something he was prepared to share. He said it pleasantly. The exchange lasted 8 more seconds, which was enough time for the call Hojumi had placed to produce its result in the form of guards entering through the main door. 6 of them. Captain Lai was behind them. Captain Lai was a tall man whose authority had a physical component. He took up space in a specific, intentional way, the kind of bearing that comes from years of being the person everyone in a room is watching. He looked at the 2 intruders, looked at Hojumi, and asked a single question about the status of the operation. Hojumi said it was undisturbed. Lai nodded and turned his attention to Qin. He asked who sent them. Qin said nobody. He said he was there because of the people in the containment units. He named the Earth Alliance, not as a threat, but as context, and watched Lai's face move through something complicated. Not guilt, not exactly. The expression of a man who'd made a decision and was being asked to look at it from the side he usually kept turned away. Lai said the Alliance had no jurisdiction here. He said J04's survival required resources the standard faction model couldn't provide, and that Hojumi's research represented a meaningful tactical advantage over the Witch Queen's forces. He said this with the evenness of someone who'd rehearsed the reasoning until it fit. He didn't look at the containment units while he said it. Qin said he understood the calculation. He said he disagreed with it. He said it directly and without heat, and something in the directness landed differently than a challenge would have. It stopped Lai for a moment, the way unexpected honesty sometimes stops people. Then the containment unit on the left made a sound that ended the conversation. The delivery sequence had begun. Not because anyone triggered it, one of the units had a mechanical fault, the kind of detail that didn't appear in Hojumi's statistics because it hadn't happened yet. The occupant of the unit, who had been level 2 before Hojumi started his process, was now becoming something else. The wall of the unit held for 40 seconds. Then it didn't. What came out of it was not a person anymore. Not fully a zombie either. Something between, with the worst properties of both: human-level tactical instinct, zombie-level pain threshold, and the particular size that forced viral mutation produced when applied to an evolutionist chassis. It hit the nearest guard, and the guard went down hard. Hojumi moved toward his bench. He had a contingency. Of course he had one. A man like Hojumi always had a contingency, and he reached for it with the focused urgency of someone implementing a plan. Xiao crossed the room before he reached it and removed the access panel from his hand with a lateral move that was technically non-damaging, which she'd done because breaking his hand would have produced a sound that mattered right now, and Hojumi's sound was less important than not alerting more guards. Hojumi looked at the space where his contingency had been. His expression was the first fully human thing about him Qin had seen. The hybrid was moving through the guards. Captain Lai had drawn a weapon and was using it with precision and no visible panic. He'd survived 4 years in the apocalypse by making good decisions under pressure, and this was still within the category of pressure he could function through. But the hybrid was absorbing the hits. The evolutionary process had pushed its threshold well above what a standard level 2 would take. Qin hit it from behind, with accumulated energy charged over 30 seconds of watching the room. The impact knocked it into the wall. It got up. He hit it again, with more, and the wall didn't survive that one either. Neither did the hybrid. In the quiet that followed, the remaining 3 containment units were all running sequences that hadn't been stopped. He asked Hojumi for the shutdown code. Hojumi said nothing. Xiao put her blade's edge very precisely against the one point where the major blood supply to the arm runs close to the surface. Not a wound, just a reminder of what one would feel like, and asked again. Hojumi gave the code. The sequences stopped. Captain Lai was standing amid his downed guards and the wreckage of the wall and looking at Qin with an expression that had moved entirely past calculation into something rawer. He asked, very quietly, what Qin was planning to do about the facility. Qin said he was planning to take the 4 people out. He said what happened to Hojumi and the research was Li's decision, and he wasn't going to make it for him. He said the Alliance would hear an account either way, and that account would describe what Lee chose here, not what he'd allowed before. He said that was the only leverage he had and he was using it honestly. Lai stood there a long time, long enough that the sound of the generator outside cycled through a full rotation. Then he stepped aside from the door. Kiki was waiting at the eastern exit. He was compact and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked younger than his situation warranted, cheerful in a way that wasn't naivety, just a temperament that had decided early on that grimness was expensive and not always useful. He was level 3, he said. He'd heard the noise from the north building and decided to see what was happening instead of pretending he hadn't, which was apparently how he'd been navigating J04 for 6 months. He said his ability was what he called bloodburst, a self-powered concussive force that released through his own bloodstream. He said the cost was personal in ways he didn't elaborate on. He said he was coming with them if that was acceptable. Xiao looked at him. She asked what he knew about the north building. He said he knew enough. He said he'd been knowing enough for 4 months and the knowing was getting heavier. She said he could come. He grinned and produced a slightly battered pack from behind the drainage pipe he'd been standing against, as though he'd had it ready, as though he'd been deciding for weeks and had been waiting for the right exit. They were 3 sectors east of J04 before Qin mentioned Hojumi's name to Ruyu. She was building an information file on him from what he described before the words were fully out, cross-referencing with the faction intelligence she'd already accumulated, slotting pieces into a structure she'd been assembling from fragments. She said Hojumi's work pattern matched reports from 2 other sectors, attributed in one case to an anonymous research party, and in the other to an accident. She said the timeline suggested he'd been active in the region for at least 3 years under different names. She said the Witch Queen's shadow organization didn't typically maintain a single long-term researcher unless the research was load-bearing. This was not a side project. Kiki, eating one of the crackers from Xiao's standing supply, with the easy comfort of someone who'd been informally accepted, asked who the Witch Queen was. Xiao gave the short version. He listened without interrupting, finished the cracker, and said that sounded like a very large problem. He said it with a thoughtfulness that his face suggested was genuine, underneath the lightness. He said he'd been in J04 long enough to know that the facility in the north building was pointing somewhere, and he'd been unable to stop thinking about where. Qin said they'd find out. Kiki nodded as if that was exactly what he expected someone who blew through a containment wall to say. Yayi arrived from the west, which nobody had expected. She appeared at the edge of a food market in the neutral sector between J04's former range and Faction 17's eastern perimeter, tall, deliberate, carrying herself with the particular composure of someone at level 7 who had decided a long time ago that announcing it would only create complications. Water moved around her hands when she wasn't actively suppressing it, a peripheral shimmer that gave her away to anyone who knew what to look for. She was looking for Qin, specifically, and by name, which was not yet a common occurrence. She said Lu Chang had pointed her in his direction. She said she'd heard an account of the J04 situation from an Alliance contact, and the account had been interesting enough to warrant direct verification. She looked at him for a moment and said his level reading was difficult to get a clean number on. She said that was unusual. He said the system complicated the standard assessment. She said she'd suspected something like that. She said she didn't have strong opinions about anomalies as long as they weren't being used against her. She said she'd been watching the Witch Queen's activity for 2 years and had concluded that stopping it required someone who could operate outside the faction structure without triggering its politics. She asked if that description applied. He said probably. She said probably was sufficient for now. She said she was joining them. Kiki said that was wonderful and offered her a cracker. She looked at it. She looked at him. She took it, which seemed to satisfy something about the situation, and the group of 5 moved east through the evening. The Witch Queen moved through information Qin was gathering the way a deep current moves under visible water. Present in everything, visible in nothing directly. Hojumi's 3-year timeline. The second sector where experiments had been attributed to accidents. A report Lu Chang forwarded about a base in the northern ruins where 12 evolutionists had simply stopped reporting in over a 6-week period. The artificial zombie king program wasn't a weapon being developed for later use. It was already in production. And the mass sacrifice ritual that Ruyu had located in 3 separate intercepted communications, fragments, each one partial, none of them complete on its own, was being prepared at a scale that none of the faction leaders who knew about it were publicly acknowledging, because acknowledging it required having a response to it. Qin calculated what a response would require. The calculation was not encouraging. He was level 6 with a golden abyssal physique and abilities that would matter significantly in direct combat. But level 6 against level 10 was not a fight. It was a fatality timeline. Zhang Shun, the Witch Queen's primary enforcer, was reportedly level 10. The Witch Queen herself was something above that, in a range where the standard measurement system started making allowances for phenomena rather than people. He needed to level faster than any standard path allowed. He needed resources his current income couldn't reach yet. He needed either a miracle or a method, and the distinction, he was learning, was mostly a question of how long you were willing to work. He had the system, he had two worlds, he had the gap between them, which nobody else was positioned to exploit. He had Ruyu and Xiao and Kiki and Yayi, each of them bringing something the others couldn't. He had Liu Chang's network and the Earth Alliance's infrastructure. He had Laku at home, steady and specific, and her genetic research access, which he hadn't fully explored yet. He sat on a rooftop in the dead city's eastern quarter as evening settled over the ruins, and the system on his arm ran its quiet calculations, and somewhere to the north, the Witch Queen's organization ran its own. Lu Junhao had not tried a second approach through hired hands. He'd tried something slower instead, a comprehensive, quiet campaign to damage Qin's business reputation through two intermediaries who specialized in the kind of corporate interference that was technically legal and practically devastating. Supply chain disruptions, false compliance flags, a whisper campaign through the financial contacts who moved in the same circles as Qin's gold exchange network. Qin found out the same way he found most things. Ruyu's information processing, applied to his own world's data flows when he gave her access during a cross-world session. She built him a complete picture of it in 40 minutes, sourced, dated, and annotated with confidence levels. He looked at it for a while. He called 3 contacts directly and resolved 2 of the disruptions that morning. The third required a meeting with the intermediary, which he attended in the same quiet, unremarkable suit he'd been wearing to business meetings since the money started. And he showed the intermediary what he knew and said he wasn't interested in the intermediary's employer and hadn't been, but that continuity of the interference would change his lack of interest. The intermediary said he'd relay the message. Qin said that was all he needed. Lu Junhao went quiet. The quiet had the quality of someone regrouping rather than retreating, but quiet was sufficient for the moment. Laku's father, who'd heard from Laku that the business disruptions had resolved themselves within a day, called Qin and asked for lunch. He used the word investment in his opening line, which was the clearest signal yet that the arithmetic had shifted. Over the meal, he asked careful questions about the import operation's scalability and made observations about diversification. He was being collegial, which was a mode Qin had never seen from him. He responded to it without marking the change directly, and they parted with the first actual handshake, not the one-handed courtesy grip the man had given him in the lobby, a full handshake, two-handed, the kind that meant something in the code of men like him. Laku texted afterward, "What did you say to him?" He wrote back, "Nothing you'd find surprising." She sent him a long row of ellipsis dots and then, "You should come over for dinner." He said he would. He meant it. In the apocalypse world, a place called the Mine had been flagged in Ruyu's index for 3 months, with a notation she described as anomalous population stability in a high-risk sector. Standard human settlements in the apocalypse contracted over time as attrition, resource competition, and zombie pressure compounded. The village near the mine hadn't contracted. It had been the same size for 6 years, give or take, in a zone that should have removed it from the map twice over. They approached it as a scouting trip, with no plans beyond observation. The village was real enough: wooden reinforced buildings, a water collection system someone had designed with care, community planting on the cleared ground surrounding it. The people looked fed. They looked more than fed. They looked calm, in the specific way of people who've reached an accommodation with their circumstances that others haven't found. The village chief met them at the edge. He was an older man, deliberate in movement, with the eyes of someone who'd carried a specific loss for a long time and learned to carry it without putting it down. He told them the village's arrangement without being asked, which suggested he'd done it before. The arrangement was simple and not simple. In the mine below, a zombie deity lived, a creature so old and so evolved that it had achieved a kind of stasis. It didn't hunt, it didn't move, it simply existed at the bottom of the shaft, generating a field that kept lesser zombies away from the surrounding area. The village lived inside that field. The village sustained the arrangement by leaving offerings at the shaft mouth. The zombie deity was, in its way, their god, not by worship but by mutual utility. Kin asked about the chief's family. The older man was quiet for a moment. He said his brother had been at the mine when the deity first manifested. He said the conversion had been complete. He said his brother was part of the deity now, in a way that was beyond specific anatomy, and that he'd spent a long time deciding whether that was grief or something else. He said the village had decided to stay. He said they'd had the conversation many times. He said Kin didn't need to save them from anything. Kin looked at the village. He looked at the shaft entrance. He said he understood. The chief nodded and offered them a meal, which they accepted, and they slept that night inside the quietest zone in the dead city, while the deity below them exhaled its ancient protective radius over the ground. They moved on in the morning. Some arrangements were not for outsiders to dismantle. The nuclear project began as a number on a spreadsheet. Kin had been running the gold conversion operation for long enough that the income had stopped feeling like a surprise and started feeling like infrastructure. The cattle venture had accelerated things significantly. Xiao Yao, whose family's genetics company held patents on accelerated reproduction sequencing, had licensed him the process at a rate that reflected both professional courtesy and something warmer that neither of them had put a name to yet. The Wagyu herd reproduced at 12 times standard rate in controlled conditions, and the real-world beef market didn't ask where high-grade product came from as long as the certifications were in order. The money had crossed a threshold where it required active management rather than careful accumulation. He knew what he needed it for. The problem was that nuclear technology had been abolished in the standard political sense. Treaty-level prohibition, enforcement infrastructure, a paper record that made acquisition essentially impossible through legitimate channels. Sarah was a contact Lu Yunyan had introduced him to through a chain of 3 intermediaries, a former defense researcher who'd moved her work into private consultation after the treaty years, operating in the specific gray area that exists when a law is comprehensive on paper and enforced only when convenient. She had partial files. She had the architecture of the thing but not the complete assembly sequence, and she said so directly, which Kin respected. Ruyu completed the sequence in 9 days. He gave her the partial files and she cross-referenced them against 4 decades of theoretical physics literature she'd absorbed during a 2-week period when she'd had access to an intact university archive in the apocalypse world. A building that had been sealed and forgotten, its collection of pre-collapse academic journals still organized on shelves under 30 years of dust. She said she was confident in the assembly sequence. She said she was very confident in it, and when Ruyu said very confident, the qualifier was doing real work. The warhead was not large. The yield was calibrated. Not city-ending, but sufficient for what he needed, which was saturation of a specific target zone, with enough energy to push the evolutionary calculus into ranges it couldn't reach through standard core absorption. The target was a city called Ranhai. It had been radioactive since the nuclear wars 200 years prior, a dead zone even within the dead world, avoided by zombies and evolutionists alike because the baseline radiation made extended presence non-viable. What Lu Chang's Earth Alliance survey data showed, buried in an appendix Kin had asked Ruyu to run against their own intelligence, was that the 2-century background radiation had produced zombie evolution at rates impossible anywhere else. The creatures inside Ranhai were, conservatively, level 8 and above. The zombie king at the center of the city's former downtown had been there for at least 80 years and was estimated at level 10. Elder Mu John had called Kin to a meeting 3 weeks after Kin had approached Lu Chang with the Ranhai proposal. Mu John was not what Kin expected from someone at level 10. He was a small man with the quality of deep stillness that very powerful things sometimes have. The stillness of something that doesn't need to announce itself. He had white hair he kept short, and he moved like water through a narrow space, without apparent effort, always exactly where he needed to be. He said he'd been watching the Witch Queen's operation for 11 years and had been unable to move against her directly because level 10 against level 10, without support, produced a result that had a meaningful probability of going the wrong way. He said he'd been waiting for a specific variable. He looked at Qin without the assessment quality most people brought to the look. Not measuring, just seeing. He said he would permit the Ranhai detonation under one condition. Qin would owe him one action, unspecified, to be called in at Mujan's timing. Qin asked what kind of action. Mujan said the kind that would only be necessary if everything else had already been tried. He said it plainly, and Qin understood it to mean the final battle when it came. He said yes. They moved into Ranhai on a Tuesday, because Ryu's analysis said atmospheric conditions on Tuesdays in this sector, based on 18 months of pressure data she'd compiled, produced the most favorable dispersion pattern for what came after. He'd stopped asking her how she'd compiled 18 months of atmospheric data. The answer was always some version of she'd had time. The warhead went in by cart, which was undignified but practical. The city's silence had a specific character, not the silence of emptiness but of occupation by things that didn't make sound as a hunting strategy. He could feel them in the peripheral sense the golden abyssal physique had given him. Presences, massive and patient, aware of the newcomers but not yet committed to a response. The evolutionary pressure at this density produced creatures that had developed something close to tactical calculation. They were waiting to see. He set the device at the geographic center of the old downtown, at the base of what had been a tower and was now an elegant skeleton of corroded steel. The Zombie King was 3 blocks north. He could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure, a deep wrongness that was also, strangely, impressive. Something that had survived 200 years of radiation and eaten its way to the top of a hierarchy that had no ceiling in this city. He armed the device. He jumped. The detonation registered in the real world as a minor seismic event attributed to geological activity, which was what Sarah's cleanup contacts were paid to maintain. In the apocalypse world, Ranhai stopped existing as a place and became an event. A column of light that was visible from 60 kilometers. Then a shockwave. Then, after a period of silence that lasted long enough to feel meaningful, the radiation dispersal began its secondary phase. The one Ryu had predicted, and Mujan had permitted access to observe. The cores. Every creature in Ranhai that hadn't been at the center, every peripheral zombie, every evolved predator that had been hunting the edges, had been pushed into rapid final evolution by the event, and was now ash. The crystals at their centers had survived, because black crystals, Ryu had determined from the literature, were not organic in the standard sense, and held different tolerances. They lay in the ruins by the thousands, vibrating with compressed evolutionary energy. Qin jumped back in wearing the full-body adaptation his physique had developed for radiation tolerance, a byproduct of the golden abyssal variant that Hojumi would have found professionally fascinating and that Qin found practically useful. He walked through the fallout with the slow, deliberate pace of someone working through something important. The cores absorbed as he moved. The system ran calculations he couldn't keep up with reading. His arm went from warm to hot. Level 7, 8. The lottery wheel activated on its own, a function that triggered at threshold crossings he hadn't predicted, spinning through its options with a randomness that turned out to be less random than it appeared at the extreme ends of the capability range. It stopped on an item that floated up from the interface in a font different from the standard text. Phoenix Sword, Level 10 weapon, bound on acquisition. He looked at the blade that materialized. It was not dramatic in appearance. No glow, no ceremony. A straight weapon in a clean, functional shape, the kind designed by someone who cared about what it did rather than how it looked. The edge was wrong in a way he couldn't describe, like a horizon that curves when it shouldn't. He held it for a moment. Level 9 registered before he reached the city's edge on the way out. Mujan was waiting at the perimeter. He looked at Qin for a moment, at the sword, and then nodded with the brief economy of someone who'd been expecting exactly this and was glad to have confirmation. He said it was time to talk about the Witch Queen's schedule. The sacrifice ritual had a date. Ryu had assembled it from 17 fragments, intercepted communications, supply movement patterns, personnel deployment logs from 3 of the Witch Queen's satellite operations. The date was 6 weeks out. The location was the old stadium in the Northern District, large enough to hold 90,000 people, which was not a coincidence. The Witch Queen's artificial zombie king program required a power source to push the subjects through the final evolutionary threshold simultaneously. The source was human life energy, in volume. 90,000 people were already being held in the feeder camps. The camps had been filling for 4 months. Qin laid this out for the group in their forward position, 2 days movement from the stadium. He didn't soften the numbers. Everyone in the room was capable of handling numbers. Kiki sat with his hands in front of him and didn't say anything for a while. He asked whether there was a realistic path to evacuating the camps. Yayi said the camp perimeter was too heavily held. The Witch Queen's forces included Jiang Xun and at least 4 level 8 enforcers, and any evacuation attempt that announced itself as an evacuation would trigger a response before the first camp was cleared. Kiki nodded. He asked what they were doing instead. Qin said the plan was to disrupt the ritual before the energy transfer completed. The timing was absolute. If the transfer reached 60%, the Zombie King subjects would reach critical mass regardless of what happened to the Witch Queen. The window to stop it was the first 40% of the ritual, which based on Ruyu's reconstruction of the energy transfer rate meant approximately 22 minutes from initiation. Jiang Xun would be inside the stadium. He'd be managing the ritual's integrity, keeping the subjects stable through the transition phase. He was level 10. The group's collective ceiling, including Mu Jian, was 2 level 10s and 1 level 9. Kong Wu Jing and Faction 17 were a problem that existed on the approach. A rival faction holding the northern corridor who would not permit passage and were loyal to the Witch Queen's interests through a combination of financial arrangement and genuine ideological alignment. They needed to be dealt with before the stadium. Qin took Kong Wu Jing personally. The man had made a habit of presenting himself as a taunting obstacle in the faction landscape, the specific kind of antagonist who understands that survival in political structures requires being too expensive to remove while remaining useful. He'd underestimated Qin consistently, from the first encounter through 3 subsequent ones, each time recalibrating his contempt rather than his assessment. He was at the faction's command post when Qin arrived, flanked by 8 level 5 enforcers and 1 level 7, and he began with the same calibrated disdain he always began with. Qin was level 9 with a phoenix sword and the golden abyssal physique, and 3 months of war running through him. The 8 enforcers went down in sequence that was too fast to be fully processed. The level 7 lasted long enough to be meaningful, and then didn't. Kong Wu Jing asked for terms in a voice that had lost its particular quality entirely. All the architecture of his confidence simply absent now, like a building whose supports had been removed. He said he would cooperate. He said it on his knees. Qin looked at him for a moment. He thought about the 14 accounts Ruyu had compiled of this man's decisions and their human cost. He thought about the camp south of Faction 17's territory that had provided 900 of the 90,000 currently held at the stadium. He thought about the question of whether mercy here was a value or a mathematics problem. He said it wasn't a conversation with options. He said he was sorry. He said it and meant it in a specific way that didn't change what he did next. The northern corridor was open by nightfall. Jay had been inside the Witch Queen's organization for 2 years, which Qin had known for 6 weeks and hadn't told anyone except Xiao, because the information's value depended entirely on nobody knowing it. Jay, whose full name Qin couldn't say in company because it would identify her relationship to Jiang Yunqing, the zombie queen who served as the Witch Queen's regional commander, was threading a needle so fine that the slightest disruption would produce a catastrophic outcome for everyone on both sides of it. She'd approached Qin through a back channel so indirect it had taken him 4 days to understand he was being approached at all. Her position was simple. She wanted her sister Jiang Yunqing alive after whatever happened with the Witch Queen. She could give him access codes, ritual timing details, and the interior map of the stadium's secondary structure. Information that Ruyu had confirmed was accurate against 3 independent sources. The price was one promise: Yunqing lives. He'd made the promise. He'd meant it. He'd told Xiao because he couldn't run the stadium approach without her, and she needed to know why Yunqing was a different category from the other targets. Xiao had absorbed this, said she trusted his assessment, and asked twice whether he was certain Jay wasn't feeding him information the Witch Queen had designed to be trusted. He said he'd considered it extensively, and he was reasonably certain. She said reasonably certain would have to be enough. Jay's codes opened the Eastern Maintenance access. Ruyu had the interior map memorized within 2 minutes of receiving it. The team split at the threshold, Mu Jian and Yayi taking the western approach toward the ritual stage, where the Witch Queen would be managing the transfer personally. Xiao and Kiki holding the secondary corridor against the internal response force that would mobilize within minutes of any disruption. Qin moving toward the stage floor through the route that Jay's map marked as the fastest and the most exposed. He went in first. That had been the plan. That had always been the plan. Inside the stadium, the sound was wrong. Not silence and not noise, but something beneath both. A frequency the ritual was generating that pressed against the inside of the chest like a second heartbeat. The holding areas were full. He moved past the perimeter of the nearest one and didn't look directly, because looking directly would have slowed him, and he couldn't afford to be slowed. But the peripheral image of what was inside those holding areas went with him. Jiang Shun was at the ritual stage's northern edge. He was level 10 in the way a collapsed star is heavy. The level didn't convey what proximity to him actually felt like, which was a constant awareness that the air between you and him was thinner than it should be. He was not large. He was perfectly ordinary in appearance and completely, absolutely wrong in presence. He'd killed Wang Shanxin, the previous system host, the man who'd spent years trying to build a pure land in the apocalypse and died for it, with the casual efficiency of someone removing an inconvenience. He'd done it because Wang Shanxin existed and was not useful to him, and that was sufficient reason. He noticed Qin at 40 meters. He didn't move. He waited. Qin moved first, leading with the Phoenix Sword and the full accumulated output of the Abyssal Physique, and the fight lasted 11 minutes and cost him more than he'd accurately calculated going in. Not the sword work, that was holding. The Phoenix Blade doing something at the interface between his attack and Jiang Shun's level 10 defense that standard weapons couldn't manage. But Jiang Shun was 10 years of combat at the ceiling of human evolutionary range, and the gap between level 9 and level 10 was not arithmetic. It was categorical. Qin took hits that moved him backward by meters at a time. His regeneration rate, one of the Abyssal Physique's secondary functions, was the only reason the hit count didn't produce a different outcome. Kiki's voice reached him through the comm channel Ryu was maintaining. 4 seconds of something he couldn't fully parse, and then a sound he recognized as a bloodburst release but louder than any he'd heard in practice. Much louder. The kind of loud that meant Kiki had not held anything back. Jiang Shun had moved to the secondary corridor when he calculated, correctly, that the lateral threat was more immediate than the frontal one. He'd identified Kiki as level 3 and treated him accordingly, which meant he approached rather than maintained position, because a level 3 was not a threat worth respecting from distance. He was correct about the level. He was wrong about what Kiki had already decided. The 5th bloodburst was everything Kiki had. He'd explained it once, months ago, in the flat informational way he explained things that were difficult. Each burst drew on cellular energy reserves that didn't fully replenish. The 5th one drew on what remained. He'd known this since before J04, before the group, before Qin. He'd been carrying it the way he carried most things, lightly, without making it other people's weight. The concussive release hit Jiang Shun full force at 3 meters. At the level differential, it didn't kill him. It damaged him. Real, significant damage. The kind that level 10 physiques don't heal immediately, that slows and staggers and opens a window. Kiki was on the floor when Qin reached the corridor. The blood burst mechanism, at its 5th release, was not survivable. Qin stood there for a moment that had no useful length. Kiki's face still had the quality it always had, the specific lightness of someone who'd made their decision early and had been at peace with it since. His pack was somewhere back at the eastern entrance. He'd left it by the drainage pipe the way he always did, as if he'd be back. Qin picked up the Phoenix Sword. He turned toward Jiang Shun. The fight's second phase lasted 4 minutes. Shun was damaged and Qin was running on something that wasn't exactly rage. Rage was too hot, too imprecise. This was colder. This was a comprehensive decision about how the next 4 minutes would go. The Phoenix Sword at full draw, with the golden abyssal physique behind it, landed at a point where Jiang Shun's level 10 regeneration could not compensate. The Enforcer went down. He went down completely. A zombie king absorbed Jiang Shun's residual power in the aftermath. The evolutionary mechanics of this world meant that level 10 energy, released suddenly, didn't dissipate. It transferred. The nearest creature capable of holding it took it, and what had been a level 7 zombie king at the stadium's northwestern wall became, in approximately 90 seconds, a level 10 problem. Mujan was already engaged with the Witch Queen at the stage. She was not fighting cleanly. She had abilities that operated outside the standard-level framework, techniques from the original pre-collapse research into human evolutionary limits, things the current faction system didn't have names for. Mujan was bleeding from his left side by the time Qin reached the stage perimeter. Yayi pulled the Zombie King's attention with water manipulation at a scale that converted most of the stadium's collected rain runoff into a simultaneous multilateral attack, buying Qin 40 seconds of uncontested approach to the creature. He used them. The Phoenix Sword interacted with Zombie King-class power differently than it had with Jiang Shun. This was evolutionary energy without the tactical intelligence, massive and directionless, and the blade cut through it the way something very sharp cuts through something very large. The king fell. The Witch Queen noticed. She turned from Mujan and looked at Qin for the first time, as something other than a peripheral variable. Her expression didn't change. She was not the kind of person whose face moved when her assessment shifted. But she released Mujan and faced Qin directly, and what she brought to that facing was the complete, absolute weight of whatever she was. Her hand was inside his chest before he processed the movement. He was standing in a field of rubble that had been a city, smoke still curling from craters, his arms not lifting. The silver hair, the flat patience, the 90,000 people who'd already fed her ritual, his arm burning where the system lived. He had one jump remaining in the counter. He'd been saving it. He hadn't been certain for what. He understood for what. He jumped. His apartment. The smell of it, ramen, old dust, the particular quiet of a room that waits. He sat on the floor with his back against the bed and the wound in his chest doing what wounds at this severity do, which is everything at once. The system's regeneration was running. The jump counter was at 0. He sat and breathed and did not pass out, which was a closer thing than he would have described to anyone. His phone was on the bed. Laku had texted 3 hours ago, a single question mark, which was her language for, "I haven't heard from you and I'm not going to say I'm worried, but I'm asking." He read it. He didn't respond yet. He breathed. The regeneration took 40 minutes to reach functional. During those 40 minutes, he did not think about Kiki, because thinking about Kiki was something that existed on the other side of this, and he needed to get to the other side first. When the counter refilled, he went back. The Witch Queen had used the 40-minute window to consolidate. The ritual was at 31%, below the threshold, still stoppable. Mujan was standing, barely, supported against the stage's northern wall by Yayi, who had taken her own damage and was running on something past reserve. Xiao was in the secondary corridor, blade drawn, holding position against 2 of the internal response force. The Witch Queen stood at the ritual center and waited for him. She'd known he would return. Creatures at her level didn't assume exits were permanent. Qin walked toward her with the Phoenix Sword at his side, and no performance to his approach. He was tired in a way he'd remember for a long time, the specific exhaustion of a body that has been asked to sustain more than its design intended for an extended period. But the abyssal physique regenerated as long as he kept moving, and the system kept drawing on it, and the sword in his hand was a level 10 weapon designed for exactly this category of target. She came at him with everything she had. He absorbed 3 hits, real ones, the kind that moved the world sideways, and stayed upright because the abyssal physique had a depth to it he hadn't fully found yet, a reserve that revealed itself only at the extreme edge of necessity. She reached for his chest again, and he moved, not away from her, toward the reach, inside it, and the Phoenix Sword went into the space between her extended arm and her center mass. Level 10 weapons against targets operating above the standard measurement system were not guaranteed. That was what Mujan had said in the 3 words he'd committed to on the subject. Not guaranteed, but. The but held. The Witch Queen's organization, built 11 years on forced evolution and human sacrifice, ended in approximately 4 seconds of irreversible process. What she'd accumulated, the life energy from the ritual's 31% completion, reversed. A wave of released energy through the stadium that knocked everyone standing off their feet. In the holding areas, the captives were still alive. The feeder sequence had not completed. The artificial zombie kings had not activated. Qin lay on the stage floor and looked at the ceiling of the old stadium, which had partially collapsed sometime in the last 2 centuries, and now framed a section of sky, the purple-gray sky of this world, which he'd been looking at long enough that it had stopped seeming wrong. Mu Jian sat against the northern wall and breathed with the focused deliberateness of someone managing significant pain. Yayi crouched beside him and held his wrist, checking something with the calm efficiency of someone who'd learned field medicine the hard way. Xiao appeared at the stage entrance, saw him on the floor, and walked toward him with her blade still drawn because she hadn't stopped to sheathe it yet. She looked at the center of the stage where the Witch Queen had been. She looked at him. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Good." It wasn't a small word from her. He knew how to read the weight of it. The aftermath had a particular texture, the specific quality of silence that follows very large, loud things. The 90,000 captives were released over 3 days through a coordinated effort between the Earth Alliance, the former Faction 17's redirected resources, and a dozen smaller organizations that had been waiting for the Witch Queen's removal to commit their support openly. Lu Chang managed the logistics with the steady competence of someone who'd been preparing for this contingency for years. He probably had been. Zhang Yunqing was alive. Jay's deal held. Yunqing was escorted out of the Northern District by an Earth Alliance team with instructions Qin had written himself. She was to be given relocation options and left to choose. She chose the Eastern Territories, away from everything she'd been. Jay disappeared into the movement of people that followed the power vacuum's collapse, which was the safest place to disappear. Qin left a message with Lu Chang's network that any contact from her would reach him. The factions that had existed in the Witch Queen's shadow began the process of repositioning around the new reality, which was, the person who'd stopped the sacrifice ritual was level 9, going on something that didn't have a clean number, held a weapon that had killed a target no standard assessment had predicted was killable, and had no apparent interest in faction politics. This combination of facts produced, in faction political terms, a specific kind of gravity. Groups don't align themselves with causes in the apocalypse. They align with outcomes. Qin had become the clearest outcome in the region. Lu Chang brought the proposal to him 6 weeks after the stadium. The major surviving organizations, Earth Alliance, the reformed remnants of several smaller factions, the independent communities that had operated outside formal structure, wanted a consolidated umbrella, a name, a framework loose enough to preserve autonomy, but clear enough to function as a shared identity. Lu Chang said they'd been running through options for what to call it. Qin thought about Wang Shanxin, the man who'd had the system before him, who'd spent years trying to build what he called a pure land, a place where people could live without the specific grinding fear of the apocalypse's worst forces. He'd been killed for the attempt by a man who'd never entertained the idea that something peaceful was worth protecting. Zhang Xun was gone. The attempt could be completed, or something like completion could exist, in the way that things in this world could be better without ever being finished. He said, "Golden Palace." Lu Chang considered it. He said it had the right quality, aspirational without being naive, solid without being corporate. He wrote it down. The organizations met 4 days later, and the meeting took most of the afternoon and produced a structure that would probably require adjustment, and probably wasn't enough and was real, which was the category of thing that mattered. The apartment was quiet when he got home, the kind of quiet that had changed in the years he'd been running between worlds. It used to be the quiet of one person in a room built for one person, a space that fit its occupant the way habit fits, without challenge or expansion. Now it was the quiet of someone arriving. Laku had put dinner together. She did this with the practical capability she applied to most things, not the self-conscious performance of caring, but the actual act of it, which looked like checking the fridge, finding what was there, and producing something from it without ceremony. The table had 2 settings. He sat down. He was tired in a way that food and sleep and time would mostly address. Not entirely. Some things you carry differently after, not heavier exactly, just shaped differently by what they've rested against. She sat across from him and looked at his face for a moment. She'd learned, in the time they'd been navigating this, to read what he wasn't saying without requiring him to say it. She didn't ask what had happened. She asked whether it was finished. He said yes. She nodded, the kind of nod that contains an entire response compressed to fit a moment that doesn't need more words than that. He ate. She told him about a development at her father's company, a genetics licensing dispute that had produced 3 weeks of meetings she described with dry, precise humor that made him laugh genuinely, the laugh that happens without effort. Her father had asked about him twice that week. She said it without editorial, just information. He said he'd call him. She said she'd believe that when she heard the call had happened. Outside the window, the city moved through its ordinary evening. Traffic, light changing across buildings, the small ambient evidence of people living in dense proximity to each other without catastrophe, which was an achievement so routine it had stopped being legible as one. He looked at it for a moment. 200 years and one dimension away, a world was rebuilding itself around a newly absent wound. Golden Palace would spend years becoming whatever it actually was, rather than what it had been named. That was the nature of things named in the aftermath of war. They grew toward their own definitions. He thought about Xiao cleaning her blade that night before JO4, the sound of the whetstone, the one question underneath the other question. He thought about Ruyu labeling her own uncertainty in ink, which was the kind of discipline that saved lives. He thought about Yayi taking a cracker and the group becoming a group. He thought about a cheerful man with a battered pack by a drainage pipe who had been deciding for weeks and had waited for the right exit. He thought about a bag of chips on a pillow, the start of everything unremarkable in how small it was. Laku was saying something about the licensing dispute's third week, and he came back to the table, to the warm light, to the food getting cold if he didn't attend to it. He picked up his fork. He listened. Outside, the ordinary evening continued being ordinary, which was, he'd learned, the rarest and most expensive thing there was.